Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this talk with Professor Jim Woodhouse. My name is Anne Cernak, and I joined Clare in February as the Senior Development Officer. I'm really pleased to be here tonight and hope to meet many of you in person soon. Our session this evening is being recorded, and the link to the recording will be made available tomorrow on the Digital Gala Week website. You're more than welcome to share the link with anyone you think would be interested in the talk. We will have lots of time for questions, so please do write your questions into the Q&A function on Zoom, and Jim will answer them after his talk. I'm delighted to introduce you to Professor Jim Woodhouse, who is both an alumnus and fellow here at Clare. After a first degree in mathematics at Cambridge, Jim did a PhD on the acoustics of the violin in the Department of Applied Mathematics and Theoretical Physics, also here at Cambridge. His PhD was inspired by a hobby interest in building instruments. Jim then worked for an engineering consultancy firm on a variety of problems in structural vibration before joining the engineering department at Cambridge, first as a lecturer, then as a reader, and eventually as a professor. Jim, thank you so much for being here with us tonight. Over to you.
Thank you. Are you receiving me? Yeah. So, hello everyone. I assume there is someone out there. Yes, I'm Jim Woodhouse. As you've just heard, I've been interested for a long time in the acoustics of musical instruments. I'm going to give you a glimpse of one little corner of that subject tonight. And phase one is for me to do some screen sharing now. I remembered that. Right. Now, there are some slides and there. So I hope you're seeing some slides. So I'm going to ask a particular question, which is, you see the baby and the spoon and the saucepan. Everyone who's had children has seen a scene like this. And as you well know, it's not actually very tuneful, maybe a lot of fun. But I'm going to be talking about instruments, percussion instruments that you can play a tune on, that can produce definite pitches. Now, I need to start with a little warning here. I will be playing audio demos, I hope, if I've done the right thing. Now, you never know whether those are going to come through properly on Zoom because internet bandwidth can be an issue. I apologize if things don't come through clearly. If you're interested enough that you want to hear things again or more clearly, there's a website which you'll be seeing later in the talk, this euphonics.org. I think all the sound or versions of all the sound demos from this talk can be found there. Right, so I'm going to be talking about this kind of thing. Here's the hardware collection of a percussion ensemble. I will be talking about this. There's a marimba and a xylophone here. Those are tuned. There's a kettle drum here. There are other drums over here which are not tuned drums, and we'll be talking about that. I won't be talking about the Chinese gongs and all the other fascinating things in this picture. So, back to the baby and the saucepan. Now, in an orchestral setting, this percussion section is usually called the kitchen. Well, here's a kitchen. It's from Pompeii, I think. So here's another collection of funny shaped objects in metal and pottery. They would all make a noise if you hit them, but on the whole, these are not the things that you use to play deliberate music. And we're going to explore why not. So we're going to say, what do you have to do to start with some object, perhaps like these things in the picture, and do a bit of vibration engineering on it so that it ends up with something tuneful. So what do you have to do to make a noise with a definite pitch? Well, I'm going to make a claim here, and you'll, in the course of this little lecture, will test whether that is true. Now, everything that makes a noise when you hit it, I'm just tapping my table in the background. Everything makes a noise when you hit it. Those noises always consist of a mixture of particular frequencies which are characteristic of that particular desk or saucepan or musical instrument, whatever it may be. So there are always lots of frequencies. And the problem really is that they are unrelated, musically unrelated frequencies most of the time. And so they don't gel in your brain to give you an impression of a definite pitch. If you want to engineer something so that you'd hear a pitch, the crude thing you can do is arrange something where actually you only hear one of those frequencies. And that's essentially what a tuning fork is. It's a cunning little piece of engineering, and you bang it on the table, you know what a tuning fork is like. You hear a clear pitch from it, and that's essentially one single frequency. Well, that's true, but boring. There is a more interesting way to start with an untuned structure and mess around with it a little. And what we would really like to do, or so I claim, is that we would like to fiddle around with those frequencies, natural frequencies that the structure has, so that at least some of them are related in what a musician would call harmonic relationships. So frequency ratios in simple whole numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So that's the theory. We're going to explore it here. You'll hear lots of examples of what happens when we do that kind of thing. But a warning first. Pitch is a slippery, tricky thing. I'm just going to play you a sound here. Listen to this. Now, was there something odd about that? You listen to any note and the one after it, and it goes up all the time. But after a while, you realize that it's actually looping back on itself and going around in circles. So that's an auditory version of the famous ever-rising staircase illusion that you might have seen, the Escher picture, for example. So something cunning has been done. If you want to know what, you have to look in my website. But it's just a warning that pitch is tricky, but actually everything to do with human perception is tricky. I'm going to show you a visual analogy in a moment, but just to make the general pitch here, this is what makes musical acoustics such an interesting subject to work on. Nearly all other areas of acoustics, vibration, they may be difficult, but they're rather dull. All you are trying to do nearly all the time is reduce the noise from the motorway at the bottom of your garden, or aeroplanes passing, or builders digging up the road and so on. Most acoustics is to do with reducing noise. But of course, with music, that's not the purpose. Music is supposed to use noise, and musicians spend a long time practicing, listening to their particular instruments, and they build up some very sensitive perceptions, and they care about details in a way that is not relevant if you're trying to reduce motorway noise, for example. Now, I'm going to show you on the next slide, there will be 2 photographs. And you have to decide instantly, are these 2 people, or is it a photo montage of 2 pictures of the same person? Are you sure? We turn it the right way up, and I think you immediately see that they're 2 different people. They are twins. These are the Kelly brothers. They're both NASA astronauts. They've both been in the space station. Now, we're just going to do that again and think through what you might be doing. All of our perceptions, whether we're talking about vision or sound, works at 2 levels. In your brain, somehow, nobody exactly knows how these things work, but you've got a great army of feature detectors, of bits of neural circuitry that are looking out for particular things, and then they tell you when they've seen them or heard them. And there are 2 types. At least there are 2 extremes, I dare say. There's a continuum. There are low-level things which everyone can do. Seeing particular colors, seeing that a shape is a circle rather than a square, that sort of thing. But then there are high-level things where you have learned to do rather high-level perceptual things. And that's what's going on with these faces. Now, you look at the upside-down faces again, and I wonder what you're doing, but I think if you're looking at those pictures and really trying to decide, are those two different faces, you'll be looking at details. You'll be saying, is this wrinkle just exactly the same shape as this wrinkle here? But as soon as it's the right way up, you're not looking at details at all. You see them as people, you see personalities, whatever that means, and straight away you know that they're two different people, although you probably find it very hard to put a finger on how you know. But we're very good at faces. I'm going to show one more visual picture. Now, this is a waterfall in Iceland. And I didn't know this when I took the picture, but when I looked at it, there is a face in this picture. Now, can you see it? Look at the grass. Follow this line down here. You see a face in profile. There's an eye. Here's the nose. Here's the mouth. And once you've got it, you can't ever look at this picture again and not see this giant grassy face in there. How do we do that? Why are we so good at faces? Why did it matter so much when I turned the face upside down and suddenly you lost discrimination? Perception is tricksy. So back to what we're trying to do. Now, I already said that all sounds of anything, when you make a noise on it, when you tap on it, consist of a mixture of frequencies, and they're associated with things we call vibration modes. Now, we're going to look at two very simple examples here. And these are idealized textbook cases, the sort of thing that first and second year engineering undergraduates learn about. Now, here are the first three vibration modes of a vibrating string. It's got half a wavelength, 2 half wavelengths, 3 half wavelengths. The series would continue and you can guess how it would look. Not obvious, but for the perfect kind of string that appears in textbooks, the ratios of frequencies of these that you see here are exactly in the ratio 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 to 5 if we continued. And that's why stretched strings are a really good starting point for making musical instruments you can play tunes on. That's the guitar, the piano, and so on. But nearly all structures don't do that. And here's the next simplest thing. This is a ruler or something like that, a vibrating beam. And again, we've got the first three vibration mode shapes. This thing here with progressive, one more wiggle each time you go to the next mode. And this is an engineering undergraduate problem, and they find out that the ratio of frequencies this time, we can still call the first one 1, but then the next one is 2.76, 5.40. These are not whole number ratios. These are not harmonically related frequencies. So I will claim, and we'll hear that in a moment, that this mixture of frequencies will not give you a very clear sense of a definite pitch that you'd want to play tunes on. Now, let's illustrate this. This is these red circles here are showing the frequency ratios for that beam that I just showed you. For the first mode, has a ratio of 1 by definition, the second mode, the third mode, the fourth mode, and so on. And those red circles dot out a line. The blue stars are what you get if you take each of those red circles and you simply shift it to the closest whole number multiple of the lowest frequency. So here's what it sounds like when you listen to that red frequencies. And here's what you get with the blue ones. Now you may be thinking, what's the big deal? I could hear a scale in both cases, but I'm going to play them once more. Just listen again. The first one, which is the textbook beam that doesn't have these harmonically related frequencies, if you focus on one particular sound, it's, as you go from one to the next, you can tell it's playing a scale. But if you listen to one particular sound and ask yourself, what pitch am I hearing? It's not so clear. Whereas when we do the second one with the blue stars, I think it will be clear. So here's the red circles. So not very exciting, you think, but let's do another example. Now, this is a square steel plate, something like that. This is a flat plate. It's another textbook example, but we've done the same thing. The red circles are the textbook frequencies of the first, second, third, fourth, fifth mode, and so on. The blue stars are what you get when you tweak each one to a whole number multiple of the fundamental. And as plotted on here, this doesn't look like a very big change, does it? But now we're going to have the same audio demo. You're going to hear the textbook frequencies without the harmonic relations, and then what happens when we tweak it to be harmonic, as opposed to, now that, if it came through all right for you, should have been a very striking difference. Although in the graph here, it looks as if I haven't done anything very much. The first one sounded probably a bit like the saucepan lid that the baby was hitting in the first slide. The second one doesn't sound like a metal plate at all. It sounds more like a string, because we're used to hearing strings producing all these harmonically related frequencies. Okay, so that's all textbook examples, but now we want to get back to these actual musical instruments and start to look at the vibration engineering that people have done on these different things. Now, here is a marimba or xylophone. This is essentially like our bending beam that we just looked at, but here are some individual notes, and you can see someone's done something to it. They've hollowed it out underneath, presumably for some good reason. Well, here's a picture I've stolen from a textbook. Here are some measurements on a marimba bar of the first few frequencies. And we've got sketches of the mode shapes here, 7 of them. And if you can remember what the little animation looked like a few slides back, they look just like that. Really very similar, subtly different, but essentially the same. So the mode shapes are more or less what we saw for the textbook. But we look at the frequencies, and then we say, okay, if I call this first one 1 and work out the ratios of the next. Well, they're not exactly whole numbers, but this first one, instead of something that was nowhere near a whole number, it's fairly close to 4. And I think if the maker had tried a little harder, it would have been more accurately equal to 4. But none of the others are tuned. So that's a small change from this textbook case, just to tune the first 2 modes into whole number ratios of frequencies, a factor of 4, which is 2 octaves in music speak. So we're going to have the same kind of sound. We're going to hear the textbook beam, and then the same thing, but with these frequency ratios. Do those again, I think. Is the second one more satisfying, more firmly anchored in pitch? People think so, or they wouldn't go to this trouble. So that's the simplest example of vibration engineering to make a tuned percussion instrument. We've simply changed one frequency ratio to be fairly close to whole numbers, and already that makes a significant difference to how you hear it. Now, we're going to move on to look at a very, very old example of tuned percussion and look at church bells. And this slide is telling me that I'm going to quit out of the slides. I'm going to do this particular one from my website that I mentioned earlier, just to rub in the fact that you can look at this yourself. I hope you're seeing this. So here's the homepage, table of contents, scroll down, all kinds of fascinating stuff. And we have a section that says church bells. Now, if I just make that a bit bigger, right. So church bells, well, they're wonderfully old and traditional. Great St Mary's in Cambridge had a new set of bells made for the millennium. And I was lucky enough to be able to go on the tour of the bell foundry when they were doing it. So I've got a few pictures of a bell foundry, and it's a scene that has changed very little in a long time. Here they are pouring molten bronze out of a furnace. Now they're pouring that into the bell. Buried under this sand is a mold for the bell they're making. That is one of the ones that's now in Great St Mary's. Then they tune them. I'll be talking about that in a second. How do you tune something as big as a bell? Well, you have a kind of lathe, but it works the opposite way around to the lathe you think of. The bell stays still and the tool moves. So this is a vertical lathe, and they're someone who knows what they're doing, one would like to think, is tweaking the amount of metal in different places in order to tune the frequencies. Here are the new bells in place in Great St Mary's, and here are some bell ringers ringing them. This is Frank King, the university bell ringer. Just give you a little snatch of English change ringing. So can you play tunes on church bells? Yes, sort of. Now, so what have they done? Why are bells bell-shaped? What have people done? Well, I'm going to give a short version of the story for that here. It turns out that there are two levels of tuning in church bells. So this is a graph of a frequency spectrum. Each one of these spikes here is one of these resonant frequencies of a bell. And they're based on measurements from two actual bells. So there's a black one and a red one. So get it the right way around. The red bell is what you might think of as an old-fashioned bell. The black one is one that has been tuned in a rather careful way to make what some people think sounds better. There's a long back history to this. It seems as if this method of tuning bells has been discovered and lost and rediscovered again over the centuries, but the place that does it now is the bell foundry you saw in the previous picture. Now I need to talk you through this. Now there are some peaks here. They're labeled 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, where the red one and the black one are right on top of each other. These numbers are not to do with frequencies, they're to do with how many wavelengths are fitted around the circumference of the bell. We needn't go into that too much. So the red bell is a kind of arbitrary, vaguely bell-shaped bell. And it automatically has this set of higher frequencies here. And indeed, if you work out the frequency ratios of these, now confusingly, the ones labeled 4, 5, and 6 have frequencies in the ratio 2 to 3 to 4 to 5 to 6. So what's these peaks where the two colors agree? They're part of a harmonic series, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, except there isn't a 1. That doesn't necessarily prevent your brain hearing the pitch that goes with where 1 would have been. It's something called the missing fundamental. We're very good at noticing pitched sounds, and so we can fill in missing information and still hear it. So the red bell has these ones with some more or less whole number frequency ratios, but the first 4 frequencies are all over the place. They're kind of random. The black bell, which is the one that's been tuned with this lathe that you just saw. Now you can't see this in the picture, but this one is at the frequency 1, the fundamental of this harmonic series. This one down here is a half, so it's an octave below the fundamental. We got 2 in between, the frequencies of 1 and 2, but it turns out that those have also been tuned to magic ratios 1.2 and 1.5. What is the significance of those? Well, those are the 3 notes of what a musician would call a minor chord. So this black bell has a harmonic series and a minor chord. And it's that minor chord that accounts for the slightly mournful sound of church bells. Now, let's just listen to these. Now, there's all sorts of stuff here. Now, if I just play you one note on the red bell and the black bell, possibly you think that those don't sound at all like the same pitch. I've just claimed, scrolling back down here, that we can hear a pitch caused by these higher peaks making part of a harmonic series. In the black bell, the other frequencies reinforce that impression. In the red bell, they interfere with it. Well, listening to one sound like that, it wasn't wonderfully convincing. They actually sound, if anything, like slightly different pitches. But if I play a few notes on the two things, a little bit more like bell ringing, then I think it does suddenly become convincing that they actually are playing the same notes. If you had to hum along to that, would you hum the same notes? Now, this one here, this was the red one, and it isn't very well tuned. It's the one you heard one note of here. And when you just hear one note, your brain concentrates on those low frequencies that are not properly tuned. And so you're confused. So, right, let me go back into the slides. And now, as they say, for something completely different. So the church bell is a very old percussion instrument. Here's one that's rather recent, the Caribbean steel pan. They're almost within living memory. The history of music in the Caribbean is all rather sad and tied up with the slave trade. The slaves on the plantations were banned from playing music because it was a focus for sedition. That didn't stop them from wanting to do it. And they improvised all kinds of musical instruments out of things that were around them and started the tradition of Carnival. Now, this is a picture of a hillside in Trinidad just after the Americans had left, where they'd had an air base, and they'd left this place littered with these old oil drums. An eyesore or a resource? The clever Caribbeans learned to make something out of these oil drums. So here's Dudley Dixon, the pan tuner. And he's making a pan here. He's got a finished one by his elbow as his tuning reference, because he's trying to make instruments that will play together in a band. Now, how is it done? So it's simply the top of an oil drum that's been shaped with this 5-pound hammer that he's got in his hand, not just to make one tuneful note, we'll hear an example in a minute, but to make lots of notes. All these little, what look like bumps, we'll come to that in a moment, play different notes. What's going on? Well, here's a technical measurement of one of these steel pans. This is done by a method called holographic interferometry. You don't need to know how it works. It's a magic trick with lasers. And what it has given you is a kind of contour map of the shape of the vibration. This looks like the contour map of a hill. And sure enough, this one little patch of the top of the drum is vibrating sort of in and out, all in one piece. Let's look at some more. So here's the one we just saw. And now I'm telling you what frequency it's at, 220, 221. If anyone's tuned into music speak, you will recognize that as a significant frequency. But that's not the only thing that happens in this little patch of the oil drum. We search a bit further up and we find another resonance at 442, exactly double this, exactly an octave above. We find another one at 548. Now, not instantly apparent that those are related, but if you divide 548 by 221, you get almost exactly 2.5, 5/2. And then we have yet another one at 885, which is double again. So this is the double octave. So somehow, first. Now then, let me go back and do that again after I've explained it. Yes, let's just listen to some computer versions of these frequencies. First, we're going to hear the flat plate that I played you before, the textbook flat plate, and then these frequencies that you're seeing here that have been measured from a steel pan. So here's the flat plate. Here's the steel pan. It has a percussive quality, but clearly tuned. You could hum that tune. And of course, everyone knows you can play tunes on these things. So how has this been done? We've just looked here at the vibration modes that are confined in one of the little patches on this drum. And he has managed, with his 5-pound hammer, not just to tune one frequency to the note that he wanted, 221 hertz, he's managed to tune 4 separate modes in this patch into harmonic relations, rather like the church bell. And the result of that is something quite tuneful to our ears. So how does it work? Well, for that, we need to look at a relative. This is the musical saw. Now, this is my cue. Just to quit sharing for a moment. No. Did I quit sharing for a moment? Are you seeing me? I'm just going to do one little live demo. Are you seeing me on the screen here? This is a perfectly ordinary saw and a wooden spoon, just like the baby had. Now, I'm holding this saw blade in my hand. If I tap it, I do not get a musical noise from it. But if I do something magic to it, I can make horrible warbling noises out of it. And perhaps, assuming you're hearing that, you weren't expecting something that rang on so thoroughly as that. What is going on? Well, let me resume sharing. And yes, I do want to do it. And yes, I want to show the slides again. To find out what's going on, we do one of these holographic pictures again. Here's one of these contour maps of the vibration of the note you were just listening to. Now, what is this showing? It's got 2 white stripes running lengthwise. Those are what are called nodal points. That's where the saw blade is not vibrating. What it's doing, it's going up in the middle and down at the 2 sides and then reversing. So if we cut a little strip out across the width, it will be vibrating just like that bending beam that we saw a little earlier. So we've got something which is bending vibration across the width of the saw. But you see what it does? It fades away before it reaches the end. And that's why we were able to get that long ringing sound. When I was holding the saw in my fingers, I was dissipating the energy. But because it has magically been able to make this vibration that doesn't reach the ends, it then allows me to hold it in my fingers. And I don't damp it out. And now saw blades are made of good quality high carbon steel, which is perfectly capable of ringing on for a long time, provided you don't interfere with it with your fingers. So that's what it's doing. How does it do it? Now, let me go back one. Do you see what the man is doing here? The magic thing you have to do is bend the saw into an S shape. And then this mode of vibration that makes the noise, he's playing it with a violin bow. That's an added extra. The S shape is the crucial thing. There's an inflection of the S here. Now remember what it's doing. It's bending across the width of the saw blade. So that bending vibration tries to travel along the saw blade. And what it finds is that the blade gets more and more curved. Now we're trying to bend in the vibration in the perpendicular direction to the bend that he's putting in with his hand. Now think about corrugated iron roofing sheet. It's very floppy when you bend it parallel to the corrugations, but it's very stiff when you try to bend across the corrugations. That's why you make corrugated sheet. The musical saw does the same thing. This bending vibration across the width, tries to travel along the length, but it meets bigger and bigger curvature. And it reaches a point where it simply can't propagate anymore. And you get a kind of total internal reflection, and it reflects back again, back through the inflection, out the other way, and it meets increasing curvature that way as well, and eventually reflects. And that is what leads to this confined mode of vibration, which is just confined by geometry. Nothing happens at this point, just the curvature of the saw blade. So back to the steel pan. Now, if I'd asked you at the beginning, what shape are the notes on a steel pan, I wonder if you would have said that they're bumps on a flat plate. Well, they're not bumps on a flat plate, actually. If you remember the picture of Dudley the tuner, the whole thing is dished. And then what he does is hammers from the back, so that the individual note regions are flat pieces embedded in a curved shell, right? Flat in the note region, curved all round. That then can reflect the vibration in the same way as the musical saw. So we can get confined vibrations in these flattish bits, and they can't escape because of the curvature. Well, they can't escape until we get to really high frequencies. What you can see by the time we get up to this high frequency here is that the whole thing is humming away in some complicated pattern. That's because the vibration is no longer confined. It can escape this curvature problem. But the first few modes, which are the ones that were tuned, are all rather tightly confined. So an ingenious bit of vibration engineering. Our last topic, we're going to look at drums. Now, here you recognize these are sort of standard drum kit drums. These are not tuned. You make noise on these, you don't play tunes on them. We're used to two kinds of tuned drums. Here's the Western orchestral kettle drum, and here's the Indian tabla. Now, two different pieces of vibration engineering. Well, the circular perfect drum is another textbook case that you can analyze. And it has vibration modes that look like these rather jolly pictures here. The details don't really matter. I've written the frequency ratios underneath, and you can search in vain more or less the whole number of ratios, 2.3, 1.59, 2.14. And sure enough, here's the sound made up out of those frequencies. Now, as with earlier demos, you could tell that a scale is being played, but the individual notes are not very crisp. Now, here's the kettle drum. The kettle drum does a trick where it manages to tune some of the frequencies. The way it does it is by taking advantage of the thing that we never remember to take into account, which is the air. The head of the drum is not very heavy. Inside that nice copper kettle that the drum was sitting on top of, there is air. The air also has vibration modes, acoustic modes. And the shape of the drum and the shape of the kettle has been cunningly tuned so that the motion of the air tweaks the frequencies around a little, so that certain of the modes take up these ratios that appear in red. There's a 3, 3.5, 4, 5. So it's got 5 modes that are tuned into musically harmonious relations. But you can't tune these ones on the top row here. Doesn't matter what you do by that method. So you don't want to hear those. And that's the reason that you don't hit a kettle drum in the middle. If you hit right in the middle, you would drive these modes very strongly, but all of these other ones have got a nodal line and zero motion in the middle. So if you hit a drum in the middle, you excite the modes you don't want to hear, and you don't excite the ones you do want to hear. So you play it in the right way. Now, so here's the sound of the kettle drum. Doesn't sound very much like a drum. These are all synthesized sounds, just using these frequencies that I've got written down here. More clearly pitched. Yes, not bad, but no cigar. The champions of tuned drums are the Indians. The Indian tabla and various related things, we'll see how it works in a moment. They have managed to tune all the modes marked with a blue number. We've got 1, 3, 5, 2 and 4, 3 again, 5 again, 5 again. So the tabla tuner somehow has managed to tune 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 modes, whereas the kettle drum only had 5. And they've used them all. They haven't wasted these ones on the top row. And here's what that sounds like. Now this is, now that doesn't sound like a tabla because you don't play tunes. It has a definite pitch, but they have a single drum, so that it's not like tabla music in any way. But just listen to these 3 things again. It's got such a definite pitch that it seems to me it doesn't sound like a drum at all. So I think we get one more go. The textbook drum, the kettle drum, and the tabla. Yes, hardly tuned at all, moderately tuned, and highly tuned. How do they do it? The secret is this black patch that you see in the middle. What the drum tuner does is puts layer upon layer of heavy paste. It's sticky rice paste weighted with manganese something or other. And they put a layer on and they scrape it down, and they put another layer on and they scrape it down, and they keep on doing that. Now here's some data where someone's done a measurement following a drum tuner up to 105 layers. This is not a job for the faint-hearted. The drum tuner has put a lot of effort into this, but they've started, you have to read this rather carefully, they've started with frequencies all over the place, and they've tracked down. So by the time they finished, we've got these things that are 1, 2, and another 2, 3, and another 3, 4, 5, the frequencies that you saw in the previous picture, all done by scraping weighted rice paste onto a membrane. And that's as much as I've got time for, just some instant wrap up here. The moral of this is that tuned percussions are interesting. An enormous amount of ingenuity. I've only scratched the surface. There are loads of other ones that we could have looked at, mostly from empirical experimentation by people messing around with things until they sounded nice. It goes around the world. Every culture has their own examples of this. We've gone from the Caribbean to the medieval church bells to India, just in the few things I've done here. And the bland final line I'm going to give you is that interesting science is all around you. Science doesn't have to be in labs. You can apply the scientist's mindset to all sorts of things that are all around you and you've just never thought about before. And that's all I'm going to say. I like to end with this slide just to give the impression of what we've done. I've told you a little bit about one corner of music. I haven't told you how all percussion instruments work. This is what this subject is like. You know, maybe we've made the edge. We've got little bits of the picture in the middle, plenty of white space, plenty of scope for more research to be done. So thank you.
Thank you, Jim. What a great presentation there. That was really very interesting. And we have some time for questions now. So please do submit your questions into the Q&A function. It's at the bottom of the Zoom screen, and I will pose them to Jim. I would just like to start with a question about the tabla. I was really intrigued about the process you said of tuning it. And well, it sounds like an instrument that has a lot of time that has to go into maintaining it. And my question was, does it have to be tuned like that frequently, more than once? Is that just done at before the first time it's played?
I think it's at the beginning. I guess if you bashed them around a little bit, it might have to go back to the tuner. Same with the Caribbean steel pans. The maker leaves them right, but then people bash it rather vigorously in these steel bands, and sometimes they have to go back in for a bit of touching up and retuning. I don't know for sure about the tabla, but I could imagine the same thing because you play the tabla with your fingertips rather than with hard drumsticks. So maybe they don't unless it gets rained on. I see it is rice paste. I imagine they would not like to get wet. What they do is, I don't know if you'd say, it's a string tension drum. So the membrane over the top has string, and then there were kind of weights, and the player will have a little hammer with them, and the first thing they do is sit on the stage and they'll tap those little weights up and down to get the overall tension adjusted so that the note it plays is in tune with the sitar or whatever they're going to be accompanying. But the magic tuning, I think, is done once for all or once in a blue moon.
Thank you. We have a question in the Q&A here. How are squeezed drums tuned? Examples, Yoruba. Is this affected through changing tension on the drum skin?
Yes, I'm guessing here. I'm sure it is, yes, because I think I don't have a mental image of one, but they're probably string tensioned as well, aren't they? So the tension in the membrane is from these cords going round, and if you squeeze those, you increase and decrease the tension. Actually, in the same way, remember my kettle drum earlier had a pedal underneath it. So orchestral kettle drums may have a pedal which allows you to change the tension in the same kind of way. So I presume that's right, except that if you're doing it in your hands, no doubt you can do glissandos and all kinds of, I mean, are these maybe these talking drums where they can imitate speech patterns and send messages over distances? And I dare say, I mean, human ingenuity knows no bounds. People find ways of turning whatever resources they have to hand into doing something, playing music, but also say in the speaking drums, you're back with those feature detectors that I was talking about earlier with the photographs. A speaking drum doesn't sound like language, but enough bits of it are enough like language that you can learn to train your feature detectors that you can tell what it is that the player was meaning to convey, in much the same way that a trained musician will hear all kinds of details in the sound of their instrument that a naive listener will not hear, because they spend hours every day listening and trying to make it do the particular thing that they want.
You played quite a few sound demos for us, and I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about how computers and modern technology have changed the study of vibrations and frequencies.
Well, that's a large question. Yeah, my sound demos were all really simple. I didn't show the slide with the equation because I didn't think this was an occasion for equations. My sound examples were deliberately super simple to make a point about the frequency. So I haven't tried to make them sound as much as possible like a church bell or a marimba. I've only made rather small efforts. So in terms of the synthesis, but there are people who do that a lot. The music technology business of sound synthesis is a very big business. In fact, it's rather frustrating. Musical acoustics as a physics discipline is hardly supported anywhere except in France, where they have a Ministry of Culture and support these things. Whereas there are music technology departments in universities all around the UK. So people doing computer music-y things, they can get research grants and so on, because there's more perceived money or perceived need for students to do courses in it or something. So people try very hard to do more and more realistic sound synthesis, except they're not just trying to be realistic. Now, there's a big difference of mindset. When a computer synthesis person makes noises like the ones I've been doing, they're providing resources for composers and performers. It may happen to sound a bit like a kettle drum or a bit like a clarinet or something, but that's actually not what matters. What matters to the performer is it interesting? Can I do something interesting with it? And they certainly don't need to slavishly follow what we believe is the true physics in a real clarinet or a real kettle drum. They're allowed to cheat. They can do anything they like that makes noises that work. whereas I'm using computer modeling to try to understand how the actual physical instruments work, the violin or what have you, and cheating isn't allowed. Because that's the aim is not to make a noise that's a bit like a guitar or a bit like a violin, but to make a noise that's based on what I think might be the governing equations. And then I find out whether it actually sounds like a guitar or not. And whatever the answer is interesting. Usually it doesn't sound as much like one as you wish it would, because this is a tricksy problem. And in real instruments, we're sensitive to all these little things. But actually, you said something else in your question, about the measurement side of things. And absolutely, the computers have transformed our ability to measure vibration. And actually, the pictures I've shown here were, these holography pictures were, that's a kind of 1960s technique mainly. It hadn't struck me until this moment. I could have had pictures done by a computer analysis method, which is usually what one would do in the lab these days. If you want to know how a violin body vibrates or something like that, you get me to give another talk about that, and I'll show you some of those. So the ability of computers to grab sounds, to analyze them into frequencies, and then to grab lots and lots of data where you tape your violin body or whatever, you tap it with a little hammer in lots of different places. And if you do enough crunching in the computer, you can not only find the resonant frequencies, but you can map out purely empirically these vibration mode shapes. And that's developed to the point where I talk to a lot of violin makers, and there are some technically minded violin makers who are doing this in the workshop, who have the kit for doing this now. So it's filtered out of the university labs back down to the instrument makers to give them another tool for controlling what they're doing. So yes, the computers get into everything. The world has been changed by them.
Well, we're able to appreciate this virtually, thanks to them.
Well, that is true enough.
I just wanted to say there's a thanks from the person who asked the previous question about the squeezed drums in the Q&A section, just saying thank you. The point about perception was particularly interesting.
Yeah, I always like to emphasize that side of it. The textbooks on musical acoustics tend to be rather light on the perception side. But really, that's why I'm writing this sort of book as a website rather than as a paper book, because the web format is just wonderful. You can have embedded animations, you can have embedded sound examples right there on the page instead of being sent off somewhere else to hear the demos. You know, it's all very well having a book with magic QR codes and you have to do something with your phone to hear the hear the demonstrations. But the website is just wonderful. They're all there for you. So it's a work in progress. There's more there than I've talked about today, but nowhere near as much as I hope will be there. I do encourage people to have a go and do send me feedback. It's a kind of open source thing. In particular, my proof checking is being crowdsourced. Do tell me if you see mistakes, or why didn't you mention this, or surely you meant that. I'm really keen to receive that kind of feedback from anyone.
Yes, thank you. And if I can ask one final question that I've been curious to ask since giving your introduction, is if you can share anything about your experience of building instruments with us.
Oh, I'm strictly an amateur on that score. Cambridge, I wonder how many people know this. Cambridge is a centre for amateur violin makers. There is a class that's been running for well over 50 years now. Now, I discovered it when I was an undergraduate at that time. So there's been a violin making class that's still going on. For a while in my undergraduate days, there was an outgrowth from it as a guitar making class. And I discovered that, and so in my final undergraduate year, I built a guitar in an evening class. And I enjoyed doing that. So I found myself still here doing a master's year. So I joined the violin making class. And at the end of that, when I thought I was going to be an astrophysicist, but I'd got fascinated by these violin things. So I started asking around to see whether it might be possible to persuade someone to supervise a PhD in violin acoustics. And as they say, the rest is history. So I still, well, my son is now a professional guitar maker. So it is something I'm rather proud of having passed on to the next generation. I do it as an amateur. He does it for real. And more strength to him.
And do you play the instruments that you've built?
Somebody plays. We've got lots of had I been on my wife's computer, you'd have had a background of instruments, but I'm in a little corner in the attic, so you don't see things here. I play plucked string things, lutes, guitars, relatives in that sort of family. Mainly my wife is a violin and viola player, so yeah, strings are what we do mostly.
Great. Well, we have another thank you actually in the Q&A. I don't know if you can see it, Jim, but someone is very much looking forward to exploring your website, very interested too in perception, especially since it took them years to perceive harmonics.
Yeah,
so,
yes. Well, you'll find a nice demo of that on the website early on. It has a nice audio demonstration of adding them in one at a time. And when you do that, you can hear them very clearly. Hearing them straight out of the mixture is quite difficult. So absolutely, that's, yeah. Do, Isabel, I see, yes, do have a go. Don't be afraid to tell me if something doesn't work. I'm interested to know.
Well, thank you so much, Jim, for that presentation and for answering all of our questions. And thank you to everyone who attended this evening. We hope to see you all back at Clare in person soon. But in the meantime, we're glad to be able to spend some time with you virtually. And I hope everyone has a very good night. Thank you again.